May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. So in light of our guest today and wanting to give him some opportunity to address the congregation, which we'll do, I think, during the time of the announcements, my sermon today is going to be a little on the shorter side. So I know you're going to be really dismayed about that. So I'll take that for what it's worth. So to dive right in today's gospel, I think this exchange between Jesus, the Herodians, and the disciples of the Pharisees is really about money and power. Let's just get to it. Money and power. I find it so telling how often Jesus ends up discussing those very same topics we are so often taught don't belong in polite conversation. These kinds of conversations often make us feel uncomfortable because they require us to think deeply about whether our lives truly reflect our beliefs. And Jesus didn't shy away from these topics because he knew they're at the heart of everything. And today, the interaction we read about revolves around a question and a coin. The question they ask, as we hear, is a carefully laid trap. They say to Jesus, "Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" The significance of the question, of course, is heightened because the tax in question is paid with a coin called a denarius. And each denarius has not only the image of the emperor engraved on it, but also the title, Son of God. The combination of a graven image and a coin which declares the emperor to be the Son of God makes this a weighted question for the Jews, to say the least. This is a question for which they believe Jesus cannot possibly have a good answer. As they see it, if he answers yes, then he would be seen as colluding with Rome and thereby justifying the oppression of the Jews. On the other hand, if he says no, he'd put himself in dangerous position of being in direct opposition to the Roman Empire. And so with this seemingly simple question, they hope to force Jesus into a no-win situation. And yet, as is often the case, Jesus refuses to answer the question directly. After first noting the hypocrisy of those who had come to speak with him, he begins his own response by asking to see the coin, and then countering with his own question. He says, "Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." Jesus' answer, it sounds simple enough, direct enough. Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. Yet, to actually make sense of this answer, we're forced to ask a further question, aren't we? What belongs to the emperor, and what belongs to God? If the coin has the image of the emperor on it, does it then belong to the emperor? Or does that too belong to God, who made everything? Or maybe in a sense it belongs to them both? See, Jesus doesn't give us a simple answer. He gives us back a question. Take a moment to just consider. On the one hand, the coin certainly bears the image of the emperor, so it's at least fair then to contend the coin belongs to him if it bears his image. But if we're then to use the language of Scripture, aren't we made in the image of God? You and I? And if, according to the logic of Jesus' statement, the coin is owed to the emperor because it bears his image, then maybe by that same logic, what we're really learning here is our very selves are owed to God because we bear his image. As one author notes, the beauty of Jesus' answer is that he both concedes payment of the census tax while subverting the reach of the emperor. Read one way, Jesus' answer is simply an affirmation of Christian submission to governing authorities. Yet, if read from another angle, Jesus affirms the all-encompassing reach of God's ownership in a way that relativizes imperial claims of right to rule. Jesus knows we live in a world where we have commitments that come from our life and community. He knows we have to pay taxes and interact with political structures which undergird every community. But he also knows these commitments are meant to be made only after we recognize the deeper commitments. As we say during the offering at services in the chapel, All things come of thee, O Lord, and of thine own have we given thee. All things come of thee, O Lord, and of thine own have we given thee. As David Lose notes, Jesus isn't then advocating a full-scale retreat from the economic and political dimensions of our lives, but instead is helping us recognize that all of these things are a part of God's divine economy. That is, he goes on to say that he thinks Jesus invites us, actually demands of us, that we be thinking regularly and relentlessly about how all of our decisions, what we buy, who we vote for, how we spend our time, should be shaped by the confession that, indeed, the whole world is God's and everything in it, including us. I think it's as if Jesus is telling those of us reading this passage that we need to get the question right first. And the question isn't really, should we pay the emperor taxes? It is, are we truly willing to give to God what is owed to God? Are we willing to make our life an offering to this God whose image we are made of? We might then wonder, what would it really look like to remember all we have as a gift from God? What would it look like if we treated every human being as if we believed they were made in God's image? How might that impact the conversations we have with one another? Conversations about race and power, about health insurance and immigration, and even about taxes. How might things change if people of faith with diametrically different political opinions, who've been elected to political office, began all of their conversations affirming these two basic principles? We are made in God's image, and all we have is a blessing from God. How might affirming these beliefs change the way we can treat one another? And how might that change the way we make use of our time, talent, and treasure when we leave this place? How might that inspire us to actually live with the kind of love made known in and through Christ? I think these are the questions we find ourselves having to face when we look at that coin and hear Jesus' words. There are as many answers, though, to these questions as there are people in this room. And the point isn't that we have to be able to answer these questions perfectly, but are we at least willing to live with them? What do we believe it means to offer to God what is God's? And does our life reflect that truth? Over the years, I have been blessed to know a number of people who've helped me see what it truly looks like to live a life with such faith in God. I'm sure you have too. But in my case, one of those people is Bishop Joseph. I've had the privilege of getting to know Bishop Joseph over the past 6 years. He reminded me this morning that when we first met, Jackson, of course, was about this big, right? So during my time at St. Michael's, one of my other duties as assigned, as it were, was to drive Bishop Joseph to and from the annual clergy conference. Our time in that car was filled with a wonderful opportunity to learn his story and the story of his people, and to just be in conversation with each other. For those of you who keep up on international news, you'll know it's an understatement to say that the situation in South Sudan is complicated. I am not going to pretend to understand the ins and outs of it all. But what I do know is that in the midst of incredible conflict and complexity, Bishop Joseph and the Diocese of Rank have been a consistent source of refuge to those in need. With faith, hope, and love, they engage realities hard for us to fathom. And I am grateful for the privilege of knowing him in the story of our brothers and sisters in the Diocese of Rank, because their stories help us understand more fully what it really means to give to God what is God's. And that's my prayer for us this week. It's that simple. We let that question linger in our hearts, and we really invite God to help us know what it means that we might live each and every day doing exactly that, giving to God what is God's. In his name, amen.